Welcome to On Your Own Terms. I'm Patty Talbot, and this is the place where we learn together what it takes to change the world on our own terms and in our own special way. Today, I have the distinct privilege of having with me Rivera Sun. Rivera is an author, a nonviolence activist, a person who teaches the skills of nonviolence, and many more things that she will tell you about today. I have to say, I've always thought of myself as a nonviolent person, but until I met Rivera, I really didn't know what I was talking about. I thought nonviolence meant just simply not fighting. But as you'll learn from her, there are actually strategies of nonviolent action that really help to change things in a way that just inaction or passivism would never do. I met Rivera a couple of years ago at the River Phoenix Center for Peace Building, and immediately I knew I had so much to learn from her. I'm so grateful today that Rivera has agreed to be with us to tell us her story using the Blue Roads framework, Homegrown Solutions for a Patchwork World. Welcome, Rivera. So glad you're here and so honored to learn from you today.
Thanks for including me in this series on change makers. It's an honor and a delight.
I'm so glad.
Today I am a nonviolence trainer and a writer of novels that feature nonviolent movements for change in the plots themselves. And then I also edit a weekly newsletter called Nonviolence News that collects 30 to 50 stories of nonviolence each week, which is pretty amazing. And so people often ask me, how did you get into doing all this? How did you get into activism? And for myself, I used to say I started in the Occupy movement. But as I started to learn more, I realized that there are really two different kinds of activism. There's the kind of activism that says no to problems and says stop the damage and the destruction. And then there's the kind of activism or nonviolence that says yes to solutions, that says we're going to build something that's needed in the world. We're going to teach ourselves how to do life differently. And when I look back at my history, that's actually where I began. I grew up on a organic farm in northern Maine. I have 4 siblings, sets of twins and a sister in between. I'm the oldest. And my parents were kind of crazy and kind of visionary. They moved us to this farm at the very northern tip of Maine when I was 13 years old. I thought that was incredibly dorky of them to do that to us. And I literally grew up pulling weeds and picking potatoes in northern Maine. But my farm was part of a cooperative of 10 small farms that started a distribution company where we would drive a truck around the state of Maine. We would pick up and produce from all these farms, and we would deliver it to Maine restaurants and grocery stores and buying clubs. And that company, Crown of Maine Organic Cooperative, is still in operation today. My sister actually is one of the founding partners and continues to help run it. My younger sister worked there for quite some time too. And they serve over 300 different businesses throughout the state, and they've really empowered and enabled local food movement, like farmers and people who like to eat local food. So to me, that's a really core piece of where I began. I began doing what we might call a constructive program, an alternative institution. And by seeing my parents organize with other farmers to create a market for their produce where there wasn't one before. We needed to sell to a larger market than just our farm stand, otherwise I wouldn't be able to support all 5 of us kids. So that's how I started doing nonviolence, and I didn't even know it then. But I would say that in 2012, I sat down to write my first novel, and I wanted to write about a nonviolent movement for change in a fictional United States. And I got about halfway through writing, and I realized I didn't know how to get my characters out of the problems that they faced. So I actually Googled how to bring down dictators nonviolently. What I found was that not only is this possible, people have been doing it all over the world. They have literally been bringing down one dictatorship after another, and not just that, they've been stopping wars, they've been winning labor equality, they've been winning women's rights, they've been working on stopping pollution and stopping destruction of environments like forests and mountains and ocean. They've been surprisingly successful at doing this. That piece really unexpected for me because, like many of us, I had heard that, oh, there's this nonviolence thing that Gandhi and King used, but it's not, I mean, nobody really wins with that stuff, right? Well, what I found out was that they actually do win over and over and over again. And in certain types of struggles, they're actually twice as successful as violence. It's like changing governments, changing dictatorships, stopping foreign invasions, and ending occupations. Imagine that. Those are the kinds of things we think we need an army for, but actually, historically speaking, when we look at all the case studies over the last 100 years, nonviolent action has been twice as successful. So when I read about that, thought that was pretty amazing, and I realized that I was pretty ignorant. I didn't know what this stuff was or how it was working, but since it seemed like it was working a lot, I thought I'd find out. So I actually started getting stacks of books and working my way through the books and revising my own novel at the same time. So every time I learned something new about strategy for nonviolent struggles, I would change what the characters were doing in the book. After the Dandelion Insurrection, which is the name of the book, came out, it was surprisingly popular. It was a wonderful thing to discover. Readers started to write to me asking me, how do we make this real? How do we do struggles like this in our own communities? And so I started to go on book tours where I would talk a little bit about the book, but mostly I would do trainings in how to use nonviolent action to make the changes that we need. And that has really shaped the course of the last 7 or 8 years for me. I've done a lot of trainings all over the United States on almost every issue you can imagine. Most recently, it's me to organize this nonviolence news service, which really opened my eyes. I thought I knew a lot about nonviolent struggle, but I discovered that there's so much more happening than any of us realized. And it was only by trying to collect all the stories each week that I discovered how remarkable people are when they organize to make sure that workers are getting paid enough, to make sure that we're not putting contaminants in streams, to make sure that our communities are resilient and strong for this time of great upheaval, economically, environmentally, socially. There's a lot of changes going on. We're being asked to change in ways that a lot of us never were before. Being asked to learn more about other people from other places, people who don't look like us, who don't necessarily come from the same backgrounds as us. And many communities, including the one that I grew up in as a small child, have really struggled with how do we make room in our hearts and our minds and still maintain our own sense of identity. We don't want to become homogenified. We don't want to become just like everybody else. So these are the things that fascinate me from stories around the world, because it's not just in the US, it's actually a global thing that more and more people are learning to make change with nonviolent struggle. When I'm looking for those 30 to 50 stories each week, I follow a few news journals that tend to report on nonviolent campaigns, but I also do searches for keywords like protests, demonstrations, strikes, boycotts. And then I scan a ton of headlines. I probably scan over 1,000 headlines each week. I read 40 different journals, but I also draw on my background of knowing the 300 methods of nonviolent struggle to spot things that people aren't calling nonviolent action, but actually are. So stories about people who are building tiny house villages. There's an unhoused population and not enough affordable housing. That's nonviolent action, but we wouldn't necessarily think of that. And then I do check my own biases. So in the US, it's really easy to find news about US stories. It's harder to see what's going on in other parts of the world. So I have to go and look for news that is coming from other places, particularly spots that we have a little bit of blinders to. The global south is a good example. Africa as a continent of many, many countries, is actually the leading edge of peace efforts and nonviolent struggles. And most people don't know this at all. It doesn't come to mind in our biased impressions of what's going on in Africa. But in 2019, there were something like 13 different major campaigns going on to end dictatorships, to stop wars, to assert human rights and economic justice struggles. And so it's pretty amazing when you start looking what you can find. So I usually work in two different settings. One might be a community that wants to train everyone in their community in nonviolent struggle. They know they're facing a lot of different kinds of issues and they want everyone to get the knowledge. A church that's brought me in. It might be a university sometimes will bring me in, or a peace and justice center. But then the other situation I often do trainings in is around people who are working on a specific issue. And they have tried all the conventional routes. They've filed petitions, they've done lawsuits, and they're kind of getting to the end of their options and they think they might need to do some direct action. So they will bring me in to help their group strategize what will that direct action look like, what do we need to know to do this successfully, and how can we prepare for the struggle. I've literally worked all over the country with so many different kinds of groups, and they're all fascinating. I mean, people have so much more knowledge and power than we often think. My job is just to give that one piece of the puzzle that might help them unlock a whole toolbox of nonviolent action. And it's one thing that comes up a lot in the workshops is people aren't as familiar with how the power of nonviolent struggle works. We know a lot about how we petition for change, how we call traditional power holders for change. We aren't as familiar with how we withdraw our cooperation and consent, how we go on strike, how we walk out of class, how we shut down the factory that we're working at, or how we engage in acts of obstruction, how we blockade a road, or we we do a blockade there. For example, there's a wonderful story from Kentucky about coal miners who the company declared bankruptcy but had refused to pay employment and back wages to the miners. So the miners blockaded the railroad tracks where the last shipments of coal were trying to get delivered so the company could rake in those profits. And a very diverse coalition of people came out to support the miners getting their justice in that situation. And they were successful. Here, where I live in New Mexico, I was asked to be a consulting advisor to a group that was organizing around a very tragic incident, or it could have been a lot more tragic, but a very sad incident in our community where a mother was driving a minivan through our state. She wasn't from the state, she was just passing through. And in our state, when you get a speeding ticket, you have to either pay it right away or you have to go down to the county building and file an extension or go before the judge and get it repealed. And for this poor mom who was traveling through the state, she was moving, that was really an onerous burden. And she got into an argument with a cop, and the cop started acting really aggressively, and she didn't feel safe. So she got back in her car and she drove away. The cop pursued and called in other cops, and it ended up in a situation in which she got pulled over again. The cop got angry. He smashed in the window of her car. He chased her 14-year-old son around the car. And as the second set of cops arrived, they fired a gun at the back of her car, trying to blow out her tires, which is like something you see on TV, but cops aren't really supposed to do. The problem that our community had was that there was some racial injustice that was happening in this, and there were some things culturally that our local cops, who are of mixed race, they tend to be Hispanic and Native and white, didn't know about how African American parents train their children, that if you're in a lonely place where nobody's around and you're being threatened by a cop, you need to go to a safe place where there are witnesses, where there are people. They've had a history of dangerous and deadly encounters. So my role was to advise the group that was pushing to get a meeting between the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference coordinators in our state and the state police who were involved, the local police and the local authorities. And so my job was to advise them on how to do a march and a demonstration that would stay nonviolent, that would deliver the messages, how to have a liaison that could help act as an ally in that situation to bring the parties to the table, and then to be at the meeting to make sure that the meeting actually progressed to a point where something could shift or change. And there's a lot more to this story, but that's a good example of a very small local campaign that was relatively successful in getting some of its goals met. There's a larger part of the justice system that was very problematic as well. So that's a small campaign. I've advised with anti-fracking campaigns, people who are concerned about the contamination issues and the threats to their watersheds. I've worked with peace groups who are trying to work on abolishing nuclear weapons or abolishing the draft and draft registration. And I will hear what's going on, and I will try to find ways that they can organize strategic nonviolent actions, or if they're planning a nonviolent action, I can help advise, here's how you improve the action you're planning to do for maximum impact, or here's how you pair it with this other kind of action. So maintaining nonviolent discipline can be really challenging for groups, and there are some rules of thumbs that people can start to work with. First of all, be outspokenly committed to nonviolence. It's a really great way to set the stage and the tone, and then to set a standard by which you can hold your movement accountable. The second is to look at different types of actions are what we call concentrated and dispersed. Concentrated actions concentrate bodies in a geographic space, like a demonstration or a march or a rally. Those are the ones that have trouble maintaining nonviolent discipline, because the other kinds are dispersed actions, and usually you're not getting people like the police or people who disagree with you. But you do need to use concentrated actions. It's good to train and prepare for them, to teach your movement de-escalation skills for yourself and for other people in the space. To appoint and train peace teams can be really helpful. These are people who wear vests, who are deciding to be neutral on the issue on that day, but will do the job of de-escalating parties as tensions rise. And then to have a nonviolence commitment and review it before you go into action is really helpful. Creativity can really help. There's one true story about this from my experience. During the thing of Gaza by Israel, yet again, another very controversial issue in our country, peace activists and I decided to hold a demonstration at our local farmers market, saying that no matter where you stand on this issue, you should call for the ending of this violence, not the way they're going to solve their problems. And I had someone who came to the demonstration who didn't want to be committed to nonviolence, which is very problematic. This is the only demonstration locally that I've actually had the cops actively called on us. So I handed her the drum and I said, we're going to do this thing where we raise our hands to show that we have blood on our hands if we do nothing. And then we're going to lower them really slowly, but we need someone to keep time. So her job was to bang the drum in a metered sense. And because she was doing that, she couldn't throw punches at anyone. She couldn't get into fights with anyone. And then I asked all the participants to do a silent protest, because one of the challenges we faced was a lot of heckling from pro-Israel supporters. So the silence and the drumming helped people maintain their focus, their calm. It gave them something to do when they were getting from the hecklers or from people who really did want to pick a fight with the activists. Some examples of how you can use creative solutions to help to maintain silence. First thing I often advise people is to look around in your community and see if anyone else is on this issue already. That's a good first step. Do a little research. King actually had 4 steps, which are very handy for new people. One is to do your research. Find out everything you can about the issue, about the conflict around the issue, and about what the solutions might be. And I said solutions plural, because oftentimes when we're working for justice, we get very fixed on one particular solution And when it comes to trying to work on the conflict, we might want more than one up our sleeves. You want to establish with your group, what are your non-negotiables? Gandhi said that if you're in negotiation and you give up on your fundamentals, that's not negotiating, that's losing. So you need to know what you can't negotiate on, what you have to stand firm. For example, drinkable water, right? That might be an issue you can't back down on because you have to drink the water. A teacher going on strike and you want, a living wage and you want tech for the classrooms. It may be that some small percentage of your living wage is negotiable, but below that is not. Or these types of computers are negotiable, but getting some computers isn't essential, must be done. You also want to see if you can resolve this with dialogue. Most groups, when they get to the point of nonviolent action, have already tried that and it hasn't worked, but it's often good to consider whether or not you're reaching for direct action when you could try going to have a conversation. We had a local issue in town I grew up in where someone put up a really offensive, discriminatory sign, and many people wanted to take the nonviolent action of writing letters to the editor. Sister called me and I said, anyone wants to go down and talk to the person? Maybe that's a good first step. So we went down and had a conversation. It turned out that his goal with that sign was to make people feel comfortable. And his goal was completely not getting met by that sign because everybody else in the town saw those discriminatory slogans that were no this, no that, no this kind of person, no that kind of person. And they didn't feel comfortable. They felt very uncomfortable. And by the time she walked back to her car, drove around the block, and came back home, the sign had already come down. If you don't know a lot about nonviolence struggle, you might want to check out Nonviolence International's website. They have 300 methods of nonviolent action on there with case studies. You might also want to do a quick search like I did and look for some short manuals. There's a lot of stuff online about basic fundamental concepts about how to organize. Use not just one action, but a set of actions to build cumulative campaigns. How the types of actions are a little bit different. Protest is not a strike, is not a blockade, and they all act a little bit differently. And then you want to do an assessment. What are you going to need to achieve the types of actions that you're going to need to do to get your goal? So do your strategy work and do your assessment work before jumping into action, because you'll find out what kind of resources you need. You might need some legal support. You might need some creative support. You might need to draw in some allies from your community to stand with you. For example, there have been numerous teacher strikes in Chicago, Oakland, and recently in Canada, in Ontario area, where the teachers go on strike. Many of their students would have challenges getting lunches. So in Oakland, they organized a strike solidarity team that fed lunches to the kids for the entire duration of the strike. In Ontario, they organized an alternative school so that parents who were working could drop off their kids at education and also to be looked after, right? These are things that you think about in order to maintain your actions, that you can achieve them. If you don't think of these kind of support and solidarity actions, the parents get pissed off at you and the kids have to go to school and you can't keep up the strike for as long as you need. I have a study guide that goes along with novel The Dandelion Insurrection, designed for people who have read the book, but it can also be used by people who have not read the novel at all. It's designed for both groups to use them. If you read the book, then what it does is it takes the novel and it shows you how to make it real, like people were asking. If you haven't read the book, then you just can apply all the sessions to your own work in your community. And it will go over a lot of the things talked about just now in greater detail and give you tools that come from the field of nonviolent struggle. I didn't invent them all. That kind of guide you how to think strategically about the work. Ironically, these are actually things that I don't just use in my actual organizing work. I also use them in my novel writing work. What I tend to do with my novels is I replace the use of violence with the use of nonviolent action. So in The Dandelion Insurrection, it's a nonviolent movement for change, and it's slightly fictionalized US. But I've also written a series to include younger people. I always say that because it seems like the older people love this series even more than The Dandelion Insurrection. and maybe even more than the kids, but the kids are really, really relating to these books. They're fantasy, which is a genre that is full of violence, like almost obscenely so. For a genre that claims to be as inventive and creative enough to come up with dragons and magic and alternative worlds, they're really not very creative when it comes to violent conflict. It's almost always there. And that's really a failure of imagination. I've found through studying nonviolent struggle is that nonviolent struggles have all of the epic mythology, the epicness, the incredible proving of the heroes or sheroes, the courage, the valor, archetypal characteristics that we love in our violent mythology. So the work I do is to weave elements from the nonviolent canon into the stories. So in Ariara's books, you might have her stopping a war instead of winning a war, organizing peace work. You have her organizing with fellow youth to end an exploitive labor situation that's leading the two countries to war with one another. The way that we can blend social justice and nonviolent action into all the elements of fantasy that we really love. I mean, people love The Lord of the Rings, they love Harry Potter, and with good reason. These are great stories. They teach us how to be heroic, they teach us how to overcome challenges or to work with friends and companions to achieve life-saving quests, right? That's all very worthy. But ultimately, if nonviolent action is twice as successful as violence, maybe we should be using that in our epic mythology and training ourselves to think that heroes aren't the ones who slay the demon, but the ones who stop the problem with nonviolent action. Writing novels actually has been a wonderful way to learn a lot about people. Nonviolent struggle itself is a global field. This is not something people who look like me invented all on their own. I mean, people who look like me actually have a great long history of nonviolent struggle. Certainly are not the only ones. And the best ideas and the best practices from all walks of life. They come from the women of Liberia's mass action for peace who stopped the civil war, indigenous struggles of the Amazonian tribes who have protected the lungs of the planet over and over and over again. They come from the civil rights movement. They come from his liberation struggle, come from all over the world. And to really learn the depth of the knowledge in this field requires a certain humility and a certain beautiful humility of letting go of the ingrained superiority that we as Americans or as educated people or as white people are taught by our society. And it's a real thing. It's a real problem. And recognizing that when we don't know, we have the opportunity to see how much other people know, how many tools and resources and experiences they bring to the table for us to learn from. That we have more tools than we think, more resources than we think, and far more power than we often think. I feel like nonviolence is actually the unacknowledged heroic story of our times. It's one of the most remarkable achievements of humankind. We talk a lot about the internet, we talk a lot about going to the moon when we think of achievements. The ability to deal with grave injustices that we face without resorting to violence, using this field that is diverse, that is effective, that is versatile, that has 300 methods of nonviolent action that has been used all over the world for thousands of years by everyone from your grandmother to Martin Luther King and Gandhi. This is what I think is one of the humankind's most powerful achievements to date.
Thank you, Rivera. I know that our audience has been inspired and informed about the practices of nonviolence, and I know that many of them will want to subscribe to your regular nonviolence newsletter, as well as check out your numerous books. And I'm going to put the link for how they can do that here. I know they can get them through Amazon, but I also know that you prefer that people come to you directly for their orders. So many amazing books. You mentioned the Dandelion Insurrection today and the Ariana series. We have some avid readers in our audience who I know will be just very eager to get their hands on those books so that they can see these nonviolent strategies that you teach in the real world in action in these beautiful, beautiful stories. Thank you so much, Rivera. I hope you'll look up Rivera and her work and follow her closely and be inspired and moved, hopefully, to take action on the issues and the situations that you're trying to change in your neck of the woods. I hope you'll also look me up, Patty Talbot at Blue Rose Education, and feel free to download my ebook that shares the 16 attributes that changemakers have in common that can be taught and can be learned. I look forward to seeing you next week on your own terms. In the meantime, may you be grounded in your beingness, guided in your doingness, generous in your connectedness, and inspired in your reflectiveness, so you can change the world on your own terms. I'm Patty Talbot. I'm always learning, and I know you are too.